Hello and welcome to another episode of I'm Just Saying. I'm Robin Battles, and the recording you're about to hear is from a video I did titled Anatomy of a Sold, the Never-Ending Escrow. And in all honesty, you guys, it should have been called Anatomy of a Sold. Why the heck didn't you fire that lender? But that being said, the content is great because there's a lot of new terms. There's a lot of negotiations that went on in this escrow. There's some tips about listing. And like I said, there's some tips about the escrow negotiations, an extension of escrow, and finally a closing, which is what we all want when we've got a buyer and a seller that's been in a transaction for 73 days. I hope you learned something. I'm Robin Battles, and I'm just saying, enjoy Anatomy of a Sold, the Never-Ending Escrow. Welcome to another episode of Anatomy of a Sold, the Never-Ending Escrow. And I deem it as, why the heck did we not fire this lender? So what I'm going to do with this particular transaction, instead of going through step-by-step everything that happened from listing to close, I want to focus on some key elements that maybe you haven't come across in a purchase or make you prepared if you're a seller or a buyer on things that can be negotiated when you hit a hiccup in your transaction, just like we did. So let me start at the listing side. Anytime I go to put a house on the market, I always meet with the seller just before we're ready to go to market, and we look at everything that's out there in the inventory. And why do I do this? Because I want to make sure if there's room for us to increase that price because of the lack of inventory, that we do so. And in this particular case, when we went on the market, there was literally no inventory that was competing against this house. So we took advantage of that and we upped the price another $10,000, and it paid off for this seller. So let me tell you terms and how we got this house into escrow. The buyer came off of an open house. So yes, open houses do get your property sold, but here's the key for a good open house. You can't have an agent that's sitting on their phone scrolling through Instagram, because they're not paying attention to the person in the room that wants to buy the house. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, because if you go to open houses just for the fun of it, and a lot of people do, and you see the agent, la, 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 I mean, you could set off a bomb in somebody's house, and this agent would be like, messed my hair up. I mean, it's crazy to me. So off on the side is this buyer that's standing there clearly waiting for my attention because I was talking to someone else. And so I finally get a chance to talk to them. And it turns out they are the buyers that bought this property. And I did represent both buyer and seller. Where we got into some trouble, I'm going to talk to you about in just a moment. But I want to get on one subject, and that's credit to a buyer for closing costs. What is it and how does it work? Because this was key in this transaction. What happened was the buyer, which is typical, especially when rates got so high as they are right now, they use that credit to buy their rate down most of the time. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds with that. So here's an example. So the house is listed for $700,000. The maximum the lender will allow as a credit. In this case, if it were a $700,000 purchase, the max typically is 3%. But here's what happens. So they asked for a credit toward closing. It was pretty hefty. It was a $17,800 credit. And so what happens is you look at what the purchase price is, and what this particular buyer did is we raised the purchase price so that the net to the seller was exactly what the seller wanted. And so sometimes you can't get sellers to understand that, but let me take it one step further. Sometimes sellers will say, but why am I going to pay all those expenses because this buyer has raised that price? So what I do, and it's not common, is I will say, we're going to adjust the commissions on the transaction based on the net price, not this gross inflated price. Because I don't think it's fair that a seller has to pay commissions on top of a credit that they're giving. It makes no sense because they're not realizing that additional money. So I don't feel they should be penalized, and paying a commission is not a penalty, but they shouldn't have another expense because they're trying to put their transaction together and give something to the buyer that the buyer is financing. I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about a couple other key elements of this transaction. Once they were done with all of their inspections and everything, we felt we had a pretty solid escrow. And then here comes the hiccup. The lender in this transaction was terrible. He asked for a 2-week extension, and the seller gave them the 2-week extension. Simple, easy, clear extension for 2 weeks. Then at the end of that 2 weeks, this lender again wanted another 2-week extension. At that point, the seller's getting annoyed that this lender is not performing, because what I am doing in the background is keeping the communication going between the buyers and the seller, because I have both sides, so that they understand that the buyer's not the issue and the seller's not the issue. It's this third-party lender that's causing the issue. But the seller wanted a guarantee that if we gave this extension and didn't go back on the market and didn't give them a notice to perform and kick them out of the deal, that they were going to perform. So we made it a little tougher on this buyer and said, hey, you're going to have to go release part of your deposit. A deposit is earnest money that's put in escrow that can't be touched unless all parties agree to it. And so all parties agreed that $10,000 non-refundable would be released to this buyer. In addition, the buyer was going to be charged a per diem. A per diem is figured out like this. It's a daily amount that a buyer is going to be charged in this transaction. And that amount was based on this. The seller's payment's $3,000. You divide that by 30. Now that $3,000 should be PITI. What's PITI? Principal, interest, taxes, insurance. That's the total payment that the seller has to pay every single month. And the seller said, it's not fair that I'm being penalized and have to wait longer to pay off my loan because this lender can't perform. So we got a $10,000 deposit released to the seller, non-refundable. And then there was a per diem charge for every day this escrow didn't close. And here's the thing. It took this lender another 43 days to close this escrow. So this buyer had an additional $3,000 charge in order to close escrow, of which the lender said, it's no big deal. They got a great deal on their loan. I will just tell you, if you spoke to me about my money that way, the fact that he spoke to the buyer about their funds that way and had no respect for their money, it blew my mind, the disrespect. He had no respect, went MIA for weeks, didn't contact escrow, didn't call me. The buyer had to chase this person around. And the only reason this buyer kept this lender is because this lender was referred by family and they didn't want to insult their family. So the lesson learned here is before you get too crazy and want to cancel your escrow, look at some terms and demands that you can put on the party that's not performing before you try and blow this entire transaction, because starting again could cost you more money. It's just things to think about, things that happen in transactions, not all the time, but it happened in this one. So 73-day escrow, from 30 to 73 days. But we kept the buyer and seller happy by keeping the transaction together, finding something that would satisfy the seller to extend that time, and then we got a closing, which is ultimately what everybody wants. I'm Robin Battles, and I hope you learned something from Anatomy of a Sold, the Never-Ending Escrow.